Good evening, friends. Thanks so much for coming on this All Saints Day.
All right.
November 1st. This is part of our Transformational Leadership series of public conversations. And tonight we're so very glad to welcome Pastor Michael A. Walrond, Jr. He's the senior pastor at First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem. Pastor Mike, as his parishioners call him, is one of the most prolific and sought-after teachers and preachers in the country. He's a visionary leader, a powerful preacher, a community builder. We've just had a couple hours together as the first part of our Transformational Leadership class, and it's been a compelling time. We've really been in good conversation, and we'll continue in that conversation for all day tomorrow. A graduate of Morehouse College and Duke Divinity School, he began ministry on the pastoral staff at the chapel at Duke University, and then serving another congregation in Durham, and then moving to Harlem to lead the First Corinthian Baptist Church, which has grown under his leadership from a struggling congregation of not very many to a congregation of more than 10,000. They've stopped counting members. His ministries and engagements are many and varied, from serving as the leader of the Mayor's Clergy Advisory Council in New York City to direct involvement in the passing of the New York City living wage legislation through the City Council. He chairs the board at Duke Divinity School and has served on the faculty at Chicago Theological Seminary and taught at Union Theological Seminary. His writing is widely seen throughout the country. He was named to the Route 100 Award, a list of the 100 most influential African Americans under the age of 45. So when was that? I don't know.
When I was under 45. I'm past that moment now.
He is married to the Reverend Dr. Lakeisha Walrond, who's the first African-American woman to serve as president of New York Theological Seminary.
Well, I would say the first woman, period, in the 119-year history.
Yeah. What a team ministry you make. Yeah. Welcome, Pastor Mike. We're really glad that you're here.
Glad to be here.
The kind of title for our conversation tonight is Missing the Signs of the Times, the Slow Walk to Irrelevancy. We've been having an interesting conversation in the class about what's going on in the church these days. Irrelevancy is a tough word, isn't it? So we want to talk tonight about the troubles that are facing the church. But let's start, if we can, by learning a little bit about First Corinthian Baptist, where you are pastor. Would you tell us a little bit of the story of that congregation?
Well, yes. I came to FCBC in 2004, and I had known the congregation because when I was in college, I used to preach their youth revival, and then when I started pastoring, I did their fall revivals. My predecessor at FCBC was my roommate for 3 semesters at Morehouse. So I knew a lot about the church, and my knowledge of the church is what made me not want to go to the church. But it became very apparent that this is where God wanted me to be. Primarily, as I shared in our session, the reason why I didn't want to leave is because in North Carolina, my wife and I had created a safe place and a safe space. When I say that, we had a great plan. It was working to the T. It started with a lot of struggle and hardship, but things were moving along quite according to plan. And I was in love with the plan and in love with how our lives were falling in line with the plan. And what I experienced in this call to New York is an utter intrusion by God, a disruptiveness that created a lot of angst. But at the same time, it was clear that I needed to be there. When I got there on the roll, they had 300 people. But on Sunday mornings, there was about 100 in a sanctuary that sat 1,900. So you can imagine how cavernous that felt. I tell people I could have taken this chair and thrown it and we hit nobody in the building. But what I believed is not only that I was supposed to be there, but the interesting location. If you ever saw the movie American Gangster with Denzel Washington, where he played Frank Lucas. And Frank Lucas said he made $1 million a day on the street where the church is, 116th Street. And his major intersection was 116th and 7th, and the church sits at 116th and 7th. And it sits between one block east, one block west, are subway lines, which meant that it was easy to get to, right? It just needed a breath of fresh air, not from me, but from God. And we just started working. And as I said, being innovative and trying to really meet the needs of the people. As I said, we had some informal conversation. Aubrey Hendricks says in his book, The Politics of Jesus, that you treat the needs of the people as holy. Oftentimes we come to church with ministry ideas that don't respond to the needs of the people because they're good ideas, or we've grown up with these traditions. But when you treat the needs of the people as holy, that means that what you do is in response and commitment to the needs of the community. So that it's not necessarily innovative, it's called being responsible. And being responsible in the community is what shapes the work that you do. So we experience that kind of explosive growth, which many people always think they want until they have it, because it comes with many challenges and good challenges, but still challenges. And we had the kind of explosive growth that was overwhelming and terrifying, to be quite honest. Between 2008 and 2013, we averaged 1,150 people joining a year. So just think about that. You know, you're seeing that many people coming every year, and people like the look of it, right? You know, church is packed, lines around the corner, 3 services a Sunday. But the work that it takes to maintain that and be responsible and maintain integrity to the work is extremely challenging. And you have to be committed to maintaining integrity, because it's easy to get lost in what is perceived as the trappings of success, especially in ministry. You would look at that ministry and say, hey, that's successful. Well, the problem in ministry is that we measure success by market values, right? If we looked at the market to measure success, Jeremiah is an utter failure, right? I mean, utter failure. You imagine preaching 20 years and nobody converted by what you preach. Right. But he's faithful. And for Jeremiah, success is measured differently. For some of us, and what I hope should be, success is measured by faithfulness to what is in front of you, not the reaction to your faithfulness. I hope that makes sense. The best illustration for that is the parable of the sower, right? The problem in ministry, and I'm just getting a little bit, and I'll stop and get your questions, but we want to control the soil without being responsible to the sowing. When you look at the parable, the reason why that parable is so, I was saying in our session together, that we have de-radicalized Jesus, we've taken the offensiveness out of Jesus, we've taken the rawness of his declaration out. But Jesus is speaking to poor people, and he's challenging them to be reckless with their seeds. So recklessly. To those who can't afford to be reckless with seeds, he's saying just sow. And your job is not to control where it lands and what happens when it lands. Your commitment is to sowing. Well, that's hard when you measure success in impact and reaction. You have to get to a point in your work where you do your work for the faithfulness of the call, not the reaction of those who you stand before, right? Because then once you get seduced by measuring success, by the trappings of success and the response of people, you find yourself down a path that leads to, I think, not destruction, but you begin to compromise the faithfulness and integrity to the charge because you start playing to the crowd. And that becomes dangerous too. So, but it's been an amazing journey. With the growth and the responsibility, has allowed us to expand. One of your graduates, Heaven, is on our staff now, and she can testify, and she has said that she had no idea the amount of work that went into doing this kind of work, because it sure is not preaching. I used to have interns from some of the schools that I won't name around the church, and They all were upset because they didn't get a chance to preach. They measured this. Well, if you go to First Corinthian, you're not going to preach, right? And I said to some, let's see the quick math. How many hours are in a 7-day week? Come on. Huh? 168 hours. If you have one service, how long are you preaching, hopefully? Hold on, how much time are you preaching? 20, 30 minutes, right? So that means if you have one service out of a 168-hour week, 30 minutes is into preaching. What is more important, whether you get to preach or you get to serve? And learning about ministry. So I'll stop. I like questions.
Well, so let's talk about the walk to irrelevancy.
Oh, yeah.
And what's that mean in a church context? What's going on with the mainline or the evangelical church that you would raise the word irrelevancy?
Yeah. Well, the reason I said slow walk to irrelevancy is because the truth is before you realize you're irrelevant, you've already died. It's like when you realize you're irrelevant, death has already come. And many of our institutions are so committed to what they believe is maintaining institutional integrity that they become, they don't like transformation. And these are words that we see through scripture. They don't like words like transformation or revelation, or they love reading the idea that God does new things, but not when God does new things with them. And so what happens is they hold on and maintain certain systems that reinforce the institution, but does not necessarily grow people, right? And in this age, as we said in our session, we're now in a very interesting moment. One, we see the trends. Church attendance is declining, right? Churches are disappearing, which has an impact on places like this, because if church attendance is diminishing, you start seeing enrollments decline too. Because for so many, the pathway to this place is coming through a church, some local religious organization. So what is happening is the religious engagement is declining, but beyond all the numbers about, they'll say that white evangelicals are diminishing, but they're maintaining numbers. The highest growth is in Latinx communities and in Catholicism, all these numbers. But here's the big number. The big number is that 46% of millennials make no claim to religious affiliation. 46%. Now, millennials now are the largest generation. So the largest generation at play in our culture, half of them make no claim for religious affiliation, which now gives you an idea of the future of quote unquote religious institutions. So what happens is, because we're not intentional about how we engage younger generations, right, we will fastly become irrelevant. Not only the numbers saying that, but then, as one of the articles I had the class read is about the age of distraction, how we live now in an attentional economy. The scarce resource now is attention, because everyone is competing for your attention, right? And are using what they're preying on your cognitive vulnerabilities. What does that mean? Your desire to want to belong. You don't want to miss out. You don't want to miss anything. That's why you hear all the time. You want to get the next thing. You want to have the next new thing for everybody else. And that is a vulnerability for technology and those who create, because they're not just trying to manipulate your ideas, they're trying to manipulate your intention. So in other words, like the article says, you don't even want what you really want anymore. You simply begin to desire what has been given and shaped and created, right? And everyone now is competing for your attention. Well, think about this. Declining attendance, churches are closing, enrollment in divinity schools, seminaries are going down. All those are happening in an age where everybody's competing for attention. How does the church and how do divinity schools compete, right? When many of our churches and even our seminaries, honestly, are reluctant to engage technology on many levels. We think, and I said this last time, we think engaging technology is innovative. No, it's opportunistic. It's everywhere. And if you don't engage it, you're just not taking advantage of the opportunity, because it's right there. So our schools are hesitant because we want to build community differently. I remember when I was on the board of trustees at Chicago Theological Seminary, before they got one of the first accredited MDiv programs. And we had a board meeting. Now, at the time, I was the youngest one on the board. And most of the board was against online learning, right? People in there, you can imagine, this is not community. You know, you can't build community this way. We got to hold on to some things that affirm humanity. And I said, okay. So I was the only one in the room who had the teenage children at the time. All right. So I said to one of his name was Bill. I said, you know, one day I was home in my bedroom, and in my daughter's room, I heard all these girls laughing and talking. And I was upset because my daughter did not ask me because she have company. So now I want to play dad, right? So I'm walking there, you know. I was going to call my daughter outside. Let me talk to you for a second. You just can't bring anybody in the room, in the house, without telling me. Well, I walk in, my daughter's on the laptop. And all her friends are on the computer. That's how community is built in this generation. We have Generation Z, which are digital natives. Everything is digital. And if you are not intentional about how you engage digital natives, or at least be thinking of how we reimagine what we do in church, we're going to be in trouble. And that irrelevancy is going to take us, and before you know it, like it's happening in Harlem, churches are closing left and right. Developers are coming in, taking the land. It's happening. And it's going to continue to happen if we don't reimagine. Now, when I talk about reimagining church, it's not really a reimagining. It's not really creating anything new. It's actually reclaiming the Jesus movement. Because what has happened over the years is I contend that the institution of church has strayed from the carpenter. And I use that language that I said earlier intentionally. When I say, well, you know what? I don't know if I'm a Christian, but I do follow the carpenter. It is a socio-economic statement. It's a political statement. Because I don't say I follow the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That language is steeped in monarchy, power, elitism, right, and oppressive structures. But when you say the carpenter, that I follow a poor Palestinian Jewish carpenter, I've just made a statement about where my allegiance lies. Well, the institution, for the sake of coercion, manipulation, and control, over the years, the centuries, backed away from the carpenter. So one example I gave in class was I'm a movie nut in Indiana Jones, right? It was when they were, and you know, I tell the story so often because it's such a good illustration to me. When Indiana Jones was looking for the cup of Jesus, the Holy Grail. And, you know, there's the villain wants to get the Holy Grail because he believes that if you dip the Holy Grail in the water, you'll have eternal life. And so he uses Indiana Jones, and he incentivizes Indiana Jones to work for him by shooting Indiana Jones' father, who's played by Sean Connery. So Indiana Jones has to find the cup and get the water to save his dad. So he goes through all the traps, the booby traps leading to it. He gets to the cave, and when he gets there, the villain follows him. That's a whole nother conversation. How the villain follows the openings created because he took the risk. Right? He takes the risk. He comes behind Indiana, and they get in the room, and lo and behold, the room is filled with cups. The whole room is filled with hundreds of cups. Now, there's an old man who looks like he's Methuselah, right? With a sword standing guard, and he's looking at them, and he sees they're about to choose, and he tells them, choose wisely. So the villain now, after Indiana has done all the hard work, he sees a cup. Now, here's a distinction. I'll end it here. Take this question. Here's a distinction. He picks up the cup, and he looks at it. It is, you know, bejeweled. It is beautiful. It is bright. It is shiny. He says, clearly, this is the cup of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He drinks and he dies. Indiana Jones now has just watched the man die from choosing the wrong cup. But his dad is dying. So Indiana Jones now takes a different approach. He looks and he's looking. Hundreds. He picks up this raggedy little cup, all torn and battered and weathered. He says, now this is the cup of a carpenter. He drinks it, nothing happens. But look at the difference. The institution, and this is very overgeneralizing, but I think you'll catch it. We're infatuated with that first cup. Mm-hmm. That cup, we've built creeds off of that first cup. We've shaped doctrine off of that first cup. We've built institutions. Well, let's not make it all rosy. We've conquered people from that first cup. Because as my theology professor at Duke, the late Frederick Herzog, said, He said, you cannot understand Western theology except through the lenses of conquest. So that cup and our allegiance to that cup has conquered people, dominated people, oppressed people, enslaved people, committed genocide, that first cup. But it's hard to commit those acts when you know who held the other cup. The carpenter language, the carpenter understanding, the movement led by the carpenter, it's hard to be co-opted. That's why the carpenter's rhetoric is not often used by those who want to maintain oppressive power. It's co-opted language. So I said all to say this. The way, I think, one of the ways that we avoid becoming irrelevant is to reclaim the carpenter's narrative. That's what I think. So.
But we're comfortable with the narrative we've been using.
Of course, because it's easy. And you know why? Because it doesn't require conviction. It requires obedience. And obedience and conviction are two different things. And sometimes the obedience is midwifed by fear. Right? So if obedience is a requirement and fear is the midwife, where do you have relationship taking place that leads to life? So our comfort and our complacency and our fear and our dis-ease often fuels our theological and our ecclesiastical aspirations. We don't necessarily want to admit that, but it's the truth, right? So
what's it look like when a congregation, when a pastor and a congregation turn, follow the carpenter, let go of some of those principalities and powers?
Well, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, but for most of you new. I can't capture fully what it looks like the same way Jesus never fully articulated what the kingdom was. Why? Jesus doesn't tell you what the kingdom is. He always tells you what it's like. And what it's like is often contextual. So a few Saturdays ago, the kingdom looked like bringing dignity back to homeless people by building, decorating the church as a mall, giving homeless and people from shelters a personal shopper, and then giving out 30,000 pounds of clothes. Because in that moment, the people, part of the problem is not that people are not in need, but sometimes the way we help people is so undignified that we forget. So in that moment, on that day, the kingdom looked like people coming and getting coats and shoes and hats, and they each had their personal shopper, and everything was free. That's what it looked like that day. On another day, on 5 days a week of the school year, there were children who had the highest amount of students who came late to school in the city were those children who lived in shelters, because it was hard to get out on time. That also meant that they missed breakfast. So then the kingdom looked like creating breakfast before books at the school, at the church, directed and targeted specifically for the parents and the kids in particular who live in shelters, so that they, even when they're running late, they could stop at the church and eat. So what does that mean? That means every week between 850 and 1,000 children get breakfast at the church. Kingdom looks like that. See, it's hard to nail down dynamism. The Spirit is dynamic. God is dynamic. You don't nail it down. The best you can do is describe it in the wake of the move. That's why Jesus said, it's like. You only say what it's like after you've encountered and experienced it, which means you just give reflections of what has already passed. But you know what it is because you felt it, right? So that means if it's like this here, and it's like that there, and it's like that there, that means there's no set definition. That's the dynamism of the kingdom. That's the dynamism of the work, right?
So people are standing in line to come into First Corinthian Baptist. Many are finding a church there. Why? What do they think what would they say they're standing in line for?
I don't know. No, There were people who were very
Cold outside sometimes.
Yeah, it is. There's people who are very critical of us because most times when you encounter things that are new, you either dismiss or demonize. And there were a lot of people who demonize us. They would say things, well, that's hip hop church, or that church is a club. Why are people standing in line? That's deep, isn't it amazing? People who preach about the gospel of thousands of people waiting to get a glimpse of Jesus have a problem with thousands of people waiting in line to hear the gospel. So what I think, what I feel is that, as I shared earlier, when I came to FCBC, I asked them what the targets were, and it's still, our targets have not changed in 15 years. And when you say target, sometimes that's not even language that people use in church, right? I asked them that, and the illustration I gave the class earlier was, right next to FCBC, there's a Chinese restaurant. I mean, if you live in New York City, there's a Chinese restaurant every corner. And but interesting though, if I walk in the restaurant by the church and I say, she says, "What is your order?" I said, "Let me get a Whopper, no cheese, extra onions." First, after looking at me like I'm crazy, she's going to say, "Go to Burger King." My request does not compel her to change her menu. Right? They're clear about what they serve. And they don't feel the compulsion, here's my task with Paul, to be all things to all people. They're clear about target. If you want a Whopper, go to Burger King. If you want 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, onions, pickles on the sesame seed bun, go to McDonald's. But don't go over here. If you want chicken lo mein, that's where you go. So that means then that if we're clear about our targets and what we're trying to do, you don't get upset when people don't come because they're not in your target scope. So who are the 3 targets? And this is helpful because you said why they stand in line, and this is part of the reason. Target number 1 is a target, as I said earlier, and some of y'all who are in class already got these notes, so be writing again. But target number 1 is the one target that everybody says is the target, the unchurched. We know that's a lie. That's a lie. You know that's a lie. Our institutions, for the most part, are not designed for the unchurched. They're not. It would look different, feel different. It's not designed for the unchurched. We are more invested in swapping members than attracting unchurched. All right? So that's one, the unchurched. But to do that, it doesn't mean you go recruit the unchurched. You create environments where the unchurched feel comfortable to come and remain. So it's environment, right? Because here's the other thing you realize, that you also don't have to worry about spreading the message in the institution. Because when the food is good, people tell the restaurant they got it from. Right? So environment, the unchurched, target number 1. Target number 2, people who are like myself, and many of us maybe in here who did grow up in church. We grew up in church, and it came a point you say, I can't do the church thing anymore. I'm out of here. I was only going because my grandmother made me, but now I got my own free will. I got my own decisions. I'm going to leave church. I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to go experimenting, right? Well, these are the persons who got disillusioned with church, right? But they still are groaning for some encounter. The problem is the rigidity and the parameters of the institution were so stifling that they did not feel like their humanity could expand. So they said, what? I'm not going to church. Last group is probably the most difficult group, and that is those who have been wounded and damaged by church. Because church hurt and church trauma is real. And to get that group in, the environment has to be one of affirmation and love, right? And a commitment to healing. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I think it's the environment, it's the dynamism of FCBC, it's the freeness. It is, to me, at times, the explosiveness of the space. Nothing that we control, right? We create spaces where we try to honor that dynamic move. And sometimes it means it looks this way one Sunday, and heaven can tell you there's no set litany, we follow liturgy, we follow the program you get is really announcements. There's no, in our mind, the team knows what we're trying to do, but we're always open to the possibility that on today, God might shift this thing, right? That's why I said earlier in the class, whenever you write down plans and you trust God, write your plans in pencil with big erasers. Because with God, everything is subject to change. And so, but I think it's those combination of things. Then you create programming that speaks to the needs. So we are the first church, I believe, in Harlem, I'm pretty sure, that opened up a free mental health facility. So we offer free, so once you get in there's a wait list, but you're in the program, you get 12 therapeutic sessions for free, each person. And then we have follow-up care. Wow. So there's groups and there's all that. So mental health becomes a major issue. Why? Because it was a need in our community. And so it started by saying, you know what, let's hire a part-time therapist on staff. Well, then she got swamped. And then it was like, we need another space. One of the trustees is a developer. He had a space around the corner he was developing. And I was like, well, let's get that, can we get that bottom floor of your building? We'll pay rent, but just boom. So we got the space, and I went and recruited this sister who I knew when she was in Columbia in the School of Social Work to come back. She's also an ordained clergy, and she came back. And here's the thing. We've been doing that. We did it, right? Built this facility in the middle of Harlem with no public money. Everything on donations. And now, it's not to say that we're not accepting public money now. But with every new initiative we do, I want the church to first embrace that you did it. You were able to do it. Now, when you do that, no one can come in and tell you what to do. Right. We'll take your assistance, but we don't need your direction. So we did that, as well as the Dream Center we had, which is 3 blocks north of the church. Why did we create the Dream Center? Because we had at the time children who a lot of activities were being cut in local schools by co-location. So you had kids in the middle school with no gym, no music, no arts. They just come to school, work, go home. So we started saying, okay, what does it look like to create a space with cutting-edge programming that's free? And the saying in Dream Center is always relevant and always free. So now you got that young person who's 10 who can come take a class on screenwriting or cinematography. You got that senior person who can come and learn how to paint at 79 years old. It's always trying to find ways to speak to the needs of the community, right, in very transformative ways. I think that's some of the reasons why people come is, we're trying to think. And now we're doing this thing, our newest venture is this kind of pop-up church experience. So November 15th to 16th, we're going to be in LA and have FCBC LA because that's some of our larger followings. The 4 places of our largest streaming population is Pennsylvania, parts of Pennsylvania, Atlanta, LA, and then North Carolina. So the reason why we chose LA is because it would be the hardest one to pull off. I was like, let's challenge ourselves first, see what we can do, and then we'll go. So always trying to think differently in how we engage the work.
So you have a close relationship with several different seminaries, and a particularly close relationship now with New York Theological Seminary.
Something like that. I guess because I'm sleeping with the president.
cut the film. What would you say should be the focus of theological education? What should people be studying? What should people be learning, exploring, doing?
Yeah. Well, this is a question I wrestled through in my role at Duke. Right?
Yeah.
As chair of the board, I mean, here's the reality. I think that first, state intention, right? Because there's several tracks in this. People who's in the MAR program, right? Okay. And MDiv, who's in MDiv program? Okay, one. So I would say the MDiv curriculums need to change. I don't think the other ones do. I think if we're actually in the business of preparing people for the parish, it ought to look a certain way and then feel a certain way. It is not to negate scholarship, because I love the life of the mind, and I love being the resident theologian, and I love being the resident philosopher. I love that responsibility. But I do realize that there has to be a beautiful merger of as we all know, theory and practice. We have to shake ourselves of the elitism that exists in our institutions. And the elitism rewards us. What is the reward? Tenure, right? And so when you've earned tenure and you now have it, you don't want to see somebody necessarily come and just get it easy or get access that you earned. But if we're going to be faithful to the church, we have to have a combination of those who are in the classroom teaching, and everybody's teaching, but it has to be practitioners involved. And you have to engage. What I would do right now, like I have conversations with my wife, we need to create ministry incubators where people begin to learn cutting-edge ways to engage ministry. When we think about our innovation incubators in seminaries and divinity schools, we're thinking about how do we do this work, especially for MDiv tracks, right? How do we do this work? How do we really begin to create vibrant communities? How do we think about best practices? How do we pull people in? I think we have to have innovation incubators. You know, there are schools around this country, universities, that have innovation labs and innovation programs, and we don't have that in a space that is screaming for innovation, right? Look at the language we use, pews, liturgy. That's old, right? We're living in antiquated spaces and then mad when someone tries to introduce something fresh, and our anger is based on our elitism, not the nature of the idea. So you got to have innovation incubators. You have to have practitioners also teaching. And whether you call, I don't care what you call it, you know, professor of the practice of theology, I don't care, but you need to have them in there. Because theology that emerges on the ground is different in some ways than what we learn. Here's what I say. This is no shade to anybody. We have a lot of people with PhDs in theology. I don't know if we have a lot of theologians. We have people who are historians of theology, right? But I don't know if they're creating and doing the work and following the dynamic move of the moment and thinking theologically. Well, at the end of the day, what happens in our institutions, we don't reward creativity. We reward conformity and compliance. We don't honor creativity, right? And so if it doesn't fit this paradigm, it doesn't fit this space, we dismiss it. This is why I said in the Gomes book, one of the books we're using is Peter Gomes, The Scandalous Gospel of Jesus. And one of the things in the book, Gomes said, here's the part that's the real headbanger. And I always say this every time I get opportunity to speak this, is that 85% of what Jesus taught had no scriptural cross-reference in the Old Testament. 85%. Wait a minute, hold on. You mean 85% of what Jesus taught wasn't in the book? Absolutely. That's why he was often asked, by what authority do you say this? Where are you getting this from? Now we've come to a place where if it can't be cross-referenced, we don't call it credible. Or published in the right places. And the truth is, we write books for 20 people.
Yeah, that's another story.
All right, that's another conversation. And we're looking for the validation by the 20 or 30 people who say, this is good. Yeah, you got it now. Now, there's no shade on the process. But the issue is, you know, I love people, like James Cone passed away. If I take a poll in the church right now, don't even know who James Cone is. Yeah, that's a generous. I would say 95%. Right? So that means we're living in bubbles. And part of it, and I have my own theory on the Cone piece, but we're living in bubbles. And people are being robbed of the opportunity to be stretched because our greatest stretchers are trying to impress one another.
What questions do you have, Pastor Mike? He's stirred you up a little bit.
There's some heat coming from there.
Yeah, a little bit. It's kind of chilly. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So that Morehouse jacket underneath there.
Oh,
See that Morehouse.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. So, Pastor Mike, thanks for coming and joining us. I heard you speak a couple of times in part of the
Oh, yeah.
What advice would you give to someone graduating, let's say, maybe
theoretical student, yeah. Yeah.
I could speak to this.
Say
'cause
receiving an appointment, I don't know.
yeah, that's what happened to me. I graduated and went right to the church at 25. So here's some advice. Let me start with what I shared earlier about preaching, because we love preaching. And yeah. Make sure your preaching is an overflow of what you believe, and not an attempt to just reaffirm everyone's prejudices. Your preaching should be the overflow of what you believe, which means there needs to be some clarity about what you believe. And when I say believe, I didn't say let it be an overflow of what you've mimicked, what you believe. Which means that this time here and even beyond ought to be a time of theological wrestling. So that you're clear. What happened with me was 2-3 months into my pastorate at 25, I realized, and I was very honest, I was like, I don't think I believe a lot of this. It sounded good in school. I remember, I wrote this beautiful paper, The Theory of Atonement. It was good. Anselm was the basis for it. I was just like, it was good. But then there was Sister Jeanette in the church, who didn't care 2 cents about my grand theological discourse. She needed embodied theology. Because the truth of the matter is, most of us proclaim a disembodied faith. We preach away from ourselves. And the conviction we have is conviction in our oratorical ability, not in our beliefs. So first, make sure your preaching is an overflow of what you believe, and do the hard work of investigating what it is you believe instead of just accepting the party line because it breeds success. You gotta be, because that means at the end of the day, you're being true and authentic. And remember this, your authenticity is your superpower anyway. Right? That's one. Two is a corporate adage that comes, fail fast and fail often. Right? Failure suggests you're taking a risk. And if you're scared of failure, you'll never be impactful. Right? Zacchaeus, he's challenged by gravity. That's me. He's short. I had to get a good word. I make it sound good. I'm challenged by gravity. All right. And Zacchaeus is committed to getting a glimpse of Jesus. You know the story. What does he do? Go up a tree, out on a limb. And he doesn't just see Jesus, he is seen by Jesus. Up a tree, out on a limb. Right? You can't be afraid to take risks, because that's where growth takes place. And the reason why I say use that bar is not mine. Fail fast means you're trying a lot. And fail often, which means you're learning quickly. Right? But you can't measure success by whether or not I avoided failure. Avoiding failure is like avoiding life. Right? This water is good. Right? How do you describe, I guess, what do you say, scientifically, the elemental chart? What would water be? H2O, right? It's water, right? If you take out the hydrogen, it's no longer water. If you take out the 2 atoms of oxygen, it's no longer water. You only have water, right, in the combination. If you try to avoid mistakes, that's not living. That's not life. Life is a combination of the successes, the mistakes, the beauty, the pain, the glory and the gore, the tragedy and the triumph. We think that somehow faithful and effective ministry is just based on one side of the equation. But remember, if you only got hydrogen, it's not water. It's all of that. So don't be afraid of failure. That's the second part. Thirdly, I would say what needs to undergird the why of your work is your hunger for healing. Right? Because if you are really hungry to see healing take place, it shapes your footsteps. It shapes your decisions. Right? Man, don't want to be famous. Because that's a big attraction. I want to be known. I was preaching a few weeks ago at a church, and the pastor is 29, and it was clear, I would never mention it, that he was fully invested in his position. I put it to you that way. He was feeling himself. Historic church, 29, brother. And he was making statements that suggested that he was enamored by getting invitations in certain pulpits. Tell the truth now. Many of us are. And so I had to just cut him off because he was like my son's age, so I became very daddy in that moment. I said, let me just say this to you. 2 things, man, if you're going to do this. I said, you take it or leave it. 1, never attach your ego to this assignment. If you attach your ego to this assignment, you'll never know when it's time to leave. Mm-hmm. Right? Because you'll always be trying to prove. You won't know how to walk away. Secondly, I said, why be infatuated with an invitation when you have an assignment? Mm-hmm. You preach it somewhere every Sunday. How do you measure your success by who invites you to preach? I mean, your insecurity can't be that rabid. So-and-so asked me to come preach for them. You put a premium on who asked you to come preach versus who called you? No. Those 3 things I would say, you hold on to those 3 things, and everything else work itself out. Yeah. All right. Yes, sir. That was his language. That was Reverend Bill's language. That wasn't mine. I like it. All right. Yeah. I worked with it.
How do you prevent humans from creating evil? You can't prevent that. That's not your work to prevent. Why would you want to prevent principalities? I welcome them. They introduced me to a part of myself I would not have seen without them. See, there's certain things you learn about your giftedness in confrontation with the things that are seeking to undermine who you are. Right? I value challenges. I value difficulty. I value even those principalities. Right? I mean, I'm in the tradition of the carpenter. How dare I say I want to prevent principalities? No, I was built for that. Right? You don't prevent that. You don't want to prevent. Because when you get into that stuff, you're simply trying to use a different way of saying you want control. Right? Even the bad things, even if it's bad and you still want control, there's still control. Prevent principalities. That's like preventing somebody from breathing. They're going to come. The only thing is, don't linger long on who creates the principality, because everyone evolves. That's what outrage culture doesn't give room for. The creator of the principality today could participate in the liberation tomorrow. So you don't define an individual by the moment that they were co-opted by something they did not know. Right? So, yeah, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
So can you kind of like,
Yeah. When I say, when I talk about success, I said measuring your success by the reaction of people. And their reaction, when you invest in the reactions of people to what you do, I didn't say the receptivity or the value or the appreciation, the reaction. So let's be clear what this is. Let's be clear when I say that. You preach, right? Pastor, what a powerful word. Oh my God, you're a great preacher. Or you come to the church, look at all these people. Oh my God. And you start living and lingering on the shores of praise. That means now you start shaping what you do to garner positive reaction. That's what I mean. When you treat the people's needs as holy, right, that means you're responding to needs, not trying to evoke their praise. The difference, right? So I could treat the people's needs as holy because of my call and my view of the sacredness of their needs. But you don't do what you do to get them to say, good job, Pastor. Nah, that's the fickleness of human beings. Remember, they will say Hosanna and then say crucify him a little bit after that. So don't hang on those words. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I shared that when I was at Duke, the dean was Dennis Campbell. And one of the things he taught us is that if you're in the church, you're the resident theologian, pastor, and your job is to lead the people theologically. I think you have to, and I said this earlier as well, you have to trust the hunger that may be manifesting itself in different ways of the people. Right? The reason why we don't do certain things, look, I was told back in the days, you meet some preacher and they hear you in the video, that stuff is good, but you can't preach that. You can't do that in church. All that theory is good. Well, that's not true. That's not true. I was in North Carolina at a congregation where the average person initially, it changed, the congregation evolved, but initially, most people only had a high school degree. And I was in there reading The Cost of Discipleship with them. I was reading Fear and Trembling with them. And I was leading them through that journey, journeying with them. You had people who didn't go to college who were talking about Tillich and the Courage to Be. Right? Some people don't know what they want until they get it. And you got to trust that they can receive it. Your job when you teach is not to impress them with your eloquence. Because a true philosopher is the one who makes the gourmet meal accessible. You're the translator. That's the measure of your intelligence. So when you get back there and you're trying to impress me and let me know you went to school, that doesn't work. But you have a responsibility because of the education you've been exposed to that you're getting now to now be the translator in ways that make the meal they never thought of palatable. That's your work, And it starts with healthy respect for the people that you teach and never feel that I'm coming. I learned this. I've been to Yale, and I'm going to come back. I'm going to get y'all right. Nah. I went to Yale, and now I got a greater responsibility to empower. Your education is not some secret gnosis that you got that you... Education is used to be a tool of empowerment, right? Because if you do it the other way, they're going to let you know. They don't got time for that foolishness. So, everybody else.
What's your hopeful version of the future church?
Oh, man. I don't know. I mean, so let's go back to where I started. There is something I have really, in these latter years, and I'm still growing, more than at any other time in my life, I've learned to be thoroughly in love with the carpenter's teaching. You know, for me, if the church is going to have a future, it can't be without the carpenter. And I don't mean symbolically, because we love the symbolism of the carpenter. Well, in Jesus' name. You know, we use Jesus' name. Like I said earlier with Thurman, we've created a religion about Jesus, but we don't know the religion of Jesus. So it is recapturing the essence of that movement, the offensiveness of it, the radicality of it, the courage of it. If we're going to have a future, that reclamation is what has to take place, that we have to get connected. Now, I said I was going to save this for tomorrow. I still am. I'm not going to go into it deep. But this may be, I'm dropping this, so if you get mad at it if I don't follow it, come and audit the class tomorrow. How do I put this? We don't have to love Paul less, but we need to stop being infatuated with him. Now, I could say more about when I drop that. I'll let you be mad at me if you offer that. Thurman is something I'm working on right now, writing with a friend of mine who's a New Testament scholar. In Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, I'm a Morehouse man. Thurman's a Morehouse man, so I've read Jesus and the Disinherited like, I don't even know, tons of times. And we were on vacation this summer, and I was sitting on the beach, and I was reading just Jesus and the Disinherited. And all of a sudden, this line that I've always read hit me differently. Thurman tells about his grandmother and how his grandmother was a slave, and she couldn't read. And she always wanted him to read the Bible to her. But she would tell him, don't read anything from Paul, because that's what the slave masters used to hold them bound. Pauline language and stuff from Paul. So she's like, don't read nothing. So Thurman was a young man when he would read for his grandmother. And then he said it never left him that as he got older, he started trying to understand what this was about. Now, if you know Howard Thurman, you've read any Howard Thurman books, Howard Thurman is a genius, not just because of the writing, but Howard Thurman, in all of his books, drops breadcrumbs in hoping that you would follow them and deepen what he said. I'm convinced. Like, here, chase that and watch what happens. Right? He does this, I kid you not. And so, in Jesus and the Disinherited, he drops this major thing. He says, if Paul was thrown in a ditch by a Roman soldier, he could make an appeal to Caesar. He said if Jesus was thrown in the ditch, he would just be another Jew in the ditch. Now, what does that mean? Now, what Thurman drops in that moment probably spoke to me more because of the cultural climate. Why do we love Pauline language, theorizing, theology, call it what you want? You know why? And why is Paul so easily co-opted by structures of power? Because there's a difference between Paul's theology and Jesus's. Paul's theology is the theology of the protected. I want you to hear this. He's a Roman citizen who actually loves the privileges of citizenship. It allows him the freedom to move. Now, although he does it in the name of spreading the gospel, he loves the privileges. He loves the opportunity in Jesus' name ministry to move freely. But his language is the language of the protected. The formulaic ways by which he describes salvation. Whereas Jesus lives in ambiguity. Paul says, do this, and you shall be saved, which suggests that if you don't do this, salvation won't come. Jesus says, discover salvation that is always ongoing. Right? Because we love the absolutes, because then we could establish hierarchies based on the absolutes, and then we can become exclusive. And then determine who's in and who's out. Right? Jesus would never say, all government is ordained by God. Not when the empire has their feet on his neck. But Paul says that because he's a protected citizen, and his access that he has is because he's a citizen, which helps you understand now the fight about migrants. There are people who don't want other people to have the rights of citizenship and privilege. But Jesus' theology is of the unprotected. The unprotected versus protected language is a transcendent idea that, if applied, I believe, eradicates the need for the labeling of revelation. Watch this. Black theology, queer theology, Latino theology. If you look at protected and unprotected, it is always evolving. Because at different moments, different people are numbered among the unprotected. Right? And in Jesus, you have a theological paradigm to give life to the unprotected. Now, here's the part that's important. Right? The language of the unprotected, the theology of the unprotected is not designed for a frontal attack on empire. It can't. It's suicide. Right? And I said in the class, we learned that years after Jesus' death, when they tried to mount an attack, destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem, impaled people in the city, death. But if I want to dismantle the power of empire without a frontal attack, how do I do it? Okay, I liberate the minds of the oppressed. So that although in empire, they learn how to regain their humanity. This is the Jesus work. Right? I was on a panel with a biblical scholar who was very critical of the church. And he said, you know, if we're going to take Jesus seriously, the church needs to be out there protesting. The church needs to be marching up to the Supreme Court. The church needs to be out there in the Capitol. And he said, you know, isn't that right, Pastor Mike? I said, actually, no. He's like, what do you mean? I said, well, brother, it sounds good. But Jesus never let him march on Rome. Hold on, what do you mean? He never let him march on Rome. But yet liberation is dripping from everything he does. If the empire says you are nobody, he says you're a child of God. And not this distant, disconnected deity who is not concerned with your life. He brings, as I said earlier, he brings God close. And then he starts giving ideas. And my friend, she's a New Testament scholar. And you know, she's so smart, it's scary. But she was talking about that word logos. Any New Testament scholars in here tonight? Okay. Well, let me drop this. She said the word we use for logos is word, that we translate is word. She said, but that's only one potential translation. The other one is idea. Hold on. The possibility that Jesus is an eternal idea waiting to be made flesh. The enfleshment, embodiment of an idea that is also transferable. The divine idea, steeped in possibility, dripping with the affirmation of humanity. empowering those who find themselves being destroyed by power. Tolstoy said that sometimes the elite don't believe in Christianity. They just use it as a tool to hypnotize the masses. Right? But the Jesus movement, you know, what Jesus seeks to do and liberate the minds of those who are unprotected. He speaks to the unprotected. He ministers to the unprotected. He seeks to embody possibility for the unprotected, even though Rome is always hovering over their possibilities. He says there's another way. There's another way. And then he introduces this kingdom of God stuff. Oh my God. And we've so taken the radicality out of that language because it has become so commonplace. We've made it synonymous with empire, tragically enough. And so the language he introduces is liberating. And then he had the audacity to couch it in love and grace. What? Not when people are used to a punitive God. That's why so many people don't come to the church, because the God they introduced to is punitive. And our introduction to God is dysfunctional. Nobody wants to admit that. Dysfunctional dependency is still dysfunctional. The kind of dysfunction and the kind of dependency that minimizes your own. Our faith, if we tell the truth, the language of the tradition is disempowering. Without you, I am nothing. What? What are you saying about the creativity and imagination of God then? If my worth is only shaped by eternal connection, not divine creativity. God made me, that's enough. That's a different way of looking at it. Or my righteousness, here come Paul now, is as a filthy rag. Huh? Disempowering language we use to try to empower people and then try to wonder why it falls flat. Right? This is not the work of the carpenter. Right? He comes and offers a possibility. So tonight's first session was called This Sickness is Not Unto Death. Resurrection Possibilities in the Midst of Death's Stench. Because when Jesus shows up in John 11 to Bethany, he's the embodiment of a possibility. He embodies a possibility in Bethany. And that possibility is the same possibility he embodies in Capernaum, in Jerusalem, in Bethesda. He embodies the same possibility. That definitions are not final. That closure does not mean over. This impossibility he embodies is amazing. He shows up and people now have a renewed sense of self-worth. In little ways, he uses words that trigger things in people. I mean, this is deep. Because we would say to ourselves, some of the words are so simplistic, like, but what does that mean? So, you know, you tell Peter, man, you know, come with me, bro, and you'll be a fisher of men. Huh? That normally would not really move you. But then again, you're not Peter, nor are you in his context. And you don't know what it means, right? To be someone who's always viewed yourself as the caught, not the catcher. Right? So that futuring is connected to a reclaiming of the ethos of the carpenter's narrative. And my God, if we do that in honesty and authenticity, with integrity and love, you know, I know it's terrifying, right? Because the carpenter says stuff like this, Bill, you know, greater things than these. What do you mean? Greater than this? Than that? What? Well, that means that Jesus somehow trusts the disciples more than they trust themselves. And believes in them more than they believe in themselves. And I'll close on this, because I could talk about this, because this is my lifeblood right here. Here's what I want to capture and try to communicate as a pastor, as a teacher. Go back to the Bethany scene, right? Well, two scenes, and I'll leave. One you heard already, one you didn't hear. Two things about possibility. One, I want to know what in the world Jesus felt walking to Bethany. What was inside of him when he said stuff like, roll the stone away? Because you know you're setting yourself up for a hard fall if this don't work out. But what is at the heart of the audacity that would make you go to Bethany with the smell of death in the air and believe there's an alternative narrative? Think about that. Think about the conviction. Forget Lazarus coming out for a second. I don't even talk about that. The conviction it takes to go there believing. And then people talking about, pray. Man, look, we don't want to pray like Jesus. We all talk about, I want to pray like Jesus. So, no, you don't. That's serious praying. Yeah. And reality is, it's two examples of prayer from Jesus. One, which you call the Lord's Prayer, Lord, teach us to pray, okay. And that's powerful. I don't want to unpack that. That's too long. That's like a 6-week sermon series, right? But watch this other prayer that you get from Jesus, because you ain't got but two in the Gospels. Here's the other one. God, I know you hear me. You always hear me. But I'm saying this publicly, basically, so that everyone around here will know who sent me. What? Ain't no feeble prayer, no mealy mouth prayer. Can you imagine saying, God, I know you hear me. You always hear me. There's never been a time when we have not been in connection. That's what he's saying. And that divine connection is what gives me the unction to stand here today and do what I'm about to do. Yeah. But I'm having this conversation with you so that people don't try to give me the praise. They understand who sent me. And then the words come forth. That means that at Bethany, he embodies possibility, here's the scary part, and human potentiality. Because after Bethany, you're going to hear that words lingering in your mind, greater things. Secondly, here's the point I think is important for us and who do this work. This is the one I said earlier. Possibility again. Resurrection. I'm not with Paul on this whole, if there's no resurrection, just eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. I don't believe that. And I don't think through resurrection as this like linchpin upon which our theological presuppositions hang. The resurrection, to me, is not the pinnacle of possibility. Now, you will say, well, hold on, Pastor, what do you mean? I mean, getting up from the dead? That's not impressive. It is, but as I shared earlier, it's the scene in the room with Thomas. Right? I love Thomas, probably one of my favorite New Testament characters, only because he's completely misunderstood. Thomas ain't scared, or he don't doubt. Because go back to the Bethany scene. He's the only one who's down to go to Bethany and says, what? If we're going to die with him, let's go die with him. How do you say that man doubts? Well, he's the only one of the 12 who's ready to go die with Jesus. So get the doubting Thomas out of our mind. Now, when you get to the scene now after the resurrection, the appearance before the disciples, the reason why this narrative takes place is because Thomas is not present. But hold on now. Where were they? I asked this question earlier. The scripture says they were locked in a room for fear. Oh, so Thomas wasn't with the fearful crew, hiding in the room. So when they come in, with the fearful people come and say, Thomas, we've seen the master. Thomas is not doubting Jesus. He's doubting the testimony of fearful men. Thomas then says, I ain't gonna believe nothing until I can put my finger in that wound, man. And then I'll believe. Now watch this. Thomas is an important figure that we miss. Until I can touch the wounds, I'm not going to believe. Hold on now. I didn't say this directly earlier. That means Thomas's belief is based on proximity to woundedness. want you to hear this. I won't believe until I can touch the wounds. So here it is. The resurrected Jesus appears again. Thomas sees the wound. He touches, and Jesus like inviting him, man, come touch it. Pause, footnote, for the preachers who's afraid to be vulnerable. Come touch it. And then all of a sudden, Thomas begins to be overwhelmed. Worship comes out. Right? Thomas's belief would only be possible if the resurrected Jesus, or would not be possible if the resurrected Jesus is risen intact. He's risen wounded. The imprints are still visible, still visible, still visible. So why it gives me hope is not because he got up, but he got up wounded. If resurrection is possible in woundedness, I got hope now. Because I can still have the tangible, visible signs of brokenness and still be resurrected. That's why it's hopeful. If Jesus comes out the tomb whole, no hope. Because what hope have you when your resurrection is necessary in your living and not post-dying? In your living, how does resurrection become a possibility if it is only possible when you're whole? But when it's a possibility in my damage, in my wounds, in my brokenness, that means that the person who's been damaged by the church can be resurrected in the same place they were damaged. The same place they've been hurt. If the carpenter is leading the way, can be resurrected. And we, as the church, must be able to enter the wounded spaces with honesty and transparency. The best way to proselytize is not by beating me with creeds, hitting me with doctrine, overtaking me with dogma. Tell somebody, touch my wounds. Let me see. Because in the fellowship of brokenness, possibility is a reality. That's what the future church has to do. Be vulnerable, be transparent, and make sure that your feet are dusty in the wake of the carpenter. That's it. So I'll stop.
Pastor Michael Walrond, we're very grateful to you for being with us.
Thank you.